Hello and welcome to our second part of the Organic Macromolecules Group's notes on lipids. So lipids are going to be oils, fats, and waxes. And many of the things that are also going to contain proteins are also going to be high in lipids. It should be noted that most of your foods are going to have a combination of a bunch of different things, not just one nutrient. So there's never anything that's like completely a carb or completely a fat, unless you are getting like straight oil. So straight oil will be a fat, and like straight sugar will be a carb. The elemental composition, it's going to be carbon and hydrogen, mostly, with some oxygen. Okay, so we're taking, it would still be CHO, C-H-O, but it will not be 25%, 50%, 25% like carbohydrates. It would be a much lower percentage. So again, we would, if we were talking about the percentages of C, H, and O, it would be something along the lines of maybe like 40%, 80%, and then, oops, that's way too high, because that adds up to more than 100. Let's say it'd be more like 30% carbon, 60% hydrogen, and then maybe 10% oxygen, and maybe even a little bit higher than that, or maybe, sorry, a little bit lower than that. But a typical fat would be like that. And the fact that it's going to have a much lower percent than a carbohydrate would means it's going to ultimately be more non-polar. So lipids are not soluble, which means they don't mix well with water because they are non-polar. Something that's non-polar means they don't have a charge, and that makes them hydrophobic. So fat and oil or whatever into water, it's not going to mix well with the water. So a simple fat, a main type of fat, is called a triglyceride. So if you just see the word fat, this is usually what you're talking about. So the fat that you consume that's in your body is generally a triglyceride. And triglycerides are going to be made up of 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. So this is a glycerol. A glycerol is a chain of 3 carbons, and to each of the 3 carbons is an oxygen, and off of each of the oxygens is another hydrogen. So these are called hydroxyl groups. And then off of each carbon is then also an additional hydrogen or 2 hydrogens. But the main thing about the fat, about a triglyceride, is the fatty acid. That's the thing that actually is the fat. That's the thing that when you are metabolizing fat, meaning you're going to use the fat as energy, you're going to metabolize a fatty acid. The glycerol isn't really going to do much for you. So all of these have this C double bonded to O, OH group. This is going to be referred to as these right here are going to be referred to as an acid group. So it's an acid functional group. Specifically, it's called a carboxyl acid group. So carboxyl acid group. And what that does is it makes it a little bit acidic. Now, once it turns into a triglyceride, it's no longer going to be acidic. But what's going to happen is in dehydration synthesis is that this H is going to be removed, and then this OH is going to be removed in the case of dehydration synthesis. It's going to be removed for water. Okay, so the other really important about fatty acids is that there are two basic types: saturated fats and unsaturated fats. And this is the key feature of the saturated fat and the unsaturated fats. To be unsaturated, you need to have double bonds between the carbons. So if you're a polyunsaturated fats, you're going to have multiple double bonds. If you're a monounsaturated fat, you're going to have a single double bond. And there's two different types of monounsaturated fats. There's the cis unsaturated fat, and then there's this trans unsaturated fat. And basically, what this trans unsaturated fat, it doesn't actually happen in nature. It's only as a result of doing something called hydrogenation to an oil. So if you take an oil is going to be something that has multiple double bonds in it. So olive oil, corn oil, whatever, they're going to have multiple double bonds. By hydrogenating the oil, they add more hydrogens to it, so they get rid of some of the double bonds and leave just a little bit of it. And usually when they hydrogenate it, they produce this trans fat. And they use hydrogenated oils in cooking of a lot of baked items. So that's what makes those bad. But as you see here, the saturated fat, those are going to be your solid fats. And as you see for the saturated fat, the key thing here is, again, going to have just single bonds between the carbon. And what makes it saturated is, if you look at the number of hydrogens on it, it's going to have, every single carbon is going to have hydrogen on it with at least 2 hydrogens. So it's as much hydrogen as this carbon chain can possibly hold. Whereas in the unsaturated fats, there is less hydrogen added to it. So it's less saturated with hydrogen. Again, a key thing, saturated fats are going to be solid, unsaturated fats are going to be oils. So they're going to be liquid at room temperature. So again, these are now going to all combine together and form what's called a triglyceride. So a triglyceride is going to look like this. There are going to be 3 of the fatty acids attached to the glycerol. So again, this H is going to be removed from the carboxyl acid site, and the OH is going to be removed from the glycerol, leaving a water. So a single water is going to be removed from each one of those different bonds. If you need to pause at this point so that you can have time to actually do the drawing, do that. And as I'm showing you here, a triglyceride can be a combination of all saturated fats or a mixture of different types of fats, as this picture is showing. Okay. All right. So next, what we're going to show is how dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis happens. And instead of redrawing the whole thing, I'm going to just draw a shorthand model, a stick model. So just to remind you, this stick model here, if I go back a ways to the beginning, the thing that's going to make these are going to be a hydrocarbon chain. And if you remember, each of these carbons we are going to be representing over here. So if I represent that carbon there, that carbon's being represented by that one. That one's there, that one's there, there, there. And we just assume the presence of the hydrogen. Okay, so this shape is referred to as the stick model, and we will use the stick model again here. So this is the glycerol, and then these are the 3 fatty acids, and hydrogen is going to be removed from the end of the fatty acids, remember from the carboxyl acid site, and what's going to be left over are 3 waters. And then a bond will form between that to form a triglyceride. So that's the stick model for dehydration synthesis. Again, if you need to pause to have time to draw, do that. Hydrolysis would work in the exact opposite way. Again, you start this time with a triglyceride, but this time you add 3 waters. And remember, the waters break up so that the H is going to go to the end here, and the OH is going to go over to the glycerol. So all those OHs now are at the end of the glycerol, and now these are the fatty acids. And this is when you digest your fats in your body, this is how it gets digested down. Each of these is then going to be used as potentially a metabolic source, or it's just going to be stored in a particular area. It should be noted that your fats are going to be used primarily for forming membranes, for energy, or for insulation and cushioning. So fats have more than twice the amount of energy of proteins and carbohydrates. A gram of fat is going to have 9 calories per gram. And then carbohydrates and proteins are going to have 4 calories per gram. But why are fats not our primary energy source? And the reason why is because fats require more energy input to actually break the bond. The way I think of it is if I had, if you remember back to when I showed a marshmallow versus a cheese ball burning, the marshmallow burned up really, really quickly. The cheese ball took a much slower amount of time to burn, and that should illustrate the fact that the cheese ball, which had more fat in it, had almost double the calories. It burned more than twice as long. Another thing to pay attention to, again, there's saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats have single bonds, and they are solid at room temperature. So if you can remember, saturated, solid, that should help you remember. Unsaturated fats are double bonded or have carbons that are double bonded. They're liquid at room temperature, and they have less hydrogen. So again, saturated, solid, single. Unsaturated is going to be liquid at room temperature. So one of the other main roles of fats in your body is as a phospholipid. And this is a big, big idea here, that lipids make up the cell membrane. That bell is extra long. Anyway, they make up the cell membrane. The phosphate group is going to allow it to, they have a phosphate group right here. And that phosphate group is going to cause it to have a little bit of a charge, allows it to interact with water and make it hydrophilic, which means water loving. And then these tails, because again, they're very nonpolar, are going to be hydrophobic, water fearing. And that's going to allow it to form into a membrane, which we'll talk about in the 4th and 5th units. Cholesterol is also going to be used in the cell membrane, and cholesterol and other things that say sterol in it have this thing called a steroid in it. Cholesterol has this extra little chain sticking off of it, but it's also going to be used in a cell membrane. Other things that are steroids are going to be things that are going to be used as hormones, which I'll talk about in a second. There are other different types of cholesterols. There's HDLs, so it's cholesterol stuck to lots of proteins, and they help your cells take in fat, so they're actually good. They're going to be found in olive oil. And then there's bad cholesterol, LDLs. There's cholesterol stuck to few proteins, and they prevent fat from getting into your cells, so that means they can clog your arteries. Butter is high in HDLs. The last two types, as I said, you have sex hormones. And again, if you remember, this is the steroid. So there are two basic steroid hormones. There's testosterone, in which both males and females produce, but males produce more of. And then estrogen, which again, both males and females produce, but females produce more of, which are steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are things that help regulate your body development. And then this is a plant pigment. This is carotenoids. If you have a pumpkin, this is certainly what is making that pumpkin orange. This is a particular carotenoid called beta carotene, and it's an orange pigment found in plants. And if you're seeing yellow in the leaves outside, that's also going to be as a result of that carotenoid. So again, to review, the basic role of fats, it's long-term energy storage, as well as cushioning and insulation. And then they can be hormones, plant pigments, and finally, they're going to be a very important role of being membranes in your cells. So that concludes our lesson on lipids.